Hello! Whoops, my holy sisters and brothers, how are you? It's Thursday evening. It's already the day before Shabbos, so we can say a Guten Erev Shabbos and a Chodesh Tov. We're starting a new month, the month of joy, Adar, which contains Purim. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who's with us as we do some beautiful learning to kick off the month of Adar, prepare for Shabbos. Stephen Giger in New Hampshire, Melissa in New York, Pauline in Arkansas, Yehuda in South Carolina, Gail in Virginia, Paul in Chicago, John in Sedona, Nancy in North Carolina, Crystal in Canada, Sharon in New Jersey. Whoa, it got skipped on me. There we go. James says shalom, and Paula says many blessings, and Nancy with us from Michigan. Paula in the great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, and Neil in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Valerie Schweitzer for the healing of Chaya F. May we only hear good news. May Chaya F have a complete and speedy recovery, a refuah shlema of body, mind, spirit, every healing that she could possibly have, and we say amen. And Valerie, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We're very grateful for your sponsorship, and we say amen. Anybody who's interested in sponsoring an episode of AT Daily, just go to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Instructions are there. How's everybody doing? You guys excited? I'm excited. Heading into Adar, the whole world could use a little bit more joy. That is for sure. Before we get into today's daf, we've been doing little teachings on the Shema all week. I got another beautiful one for you. As I've mentioned a couple times, in the line, the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. When we say it like a prayer, we will say God's name rather than a euphemism for God's name, as it were. And as we've said, it's 6 words. It's the basic declaration of God's unity and sovereignty over our lives. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. As I've mentioned a couple times, the first word, Shema, ends in ayin, and the last word, Echad, so Shema, listen, or hear, Echad, one, and the 2 letters in this line, when it's written in the Torah, that are enlarged, that a sofer, a scribe, when he's writing the Torah, must write it this way. The ayin at the end of Shema and the dalet at the end of Echad must be enlarged. Taken together, they spell ed, witness, testify, testimony. So we testify to God's oneness when we recite this prayer. But another teaching about this enlarged ayin comes from Chizkuni. So he is a rabbi writing a commentary on the Torah in the 13th century. And he has something really beautiful to say about this ayin. Right? So tonight's page, for example, is Pei Beis. So that's page 82, right? Beis, the second letter of the alphabet, that's the 2. Peh is 80. Ayin is the letter before Peh, so that it all the Hebrew letters also work as numbers. Ayin is 70. So when we were in the 70s, the pages 70 through 79, we were saying Ayin Aleph, Ayin Beis, Ayin Gimel, etc. Ayin is 70. 70 is a special number in Judaism. Although there are many more nations in the world today, 70, when we hear the number 70, we think of the nations, right? Because sort of in the Torah's time, there were 70 nations, including the nation of, or I guess outside of the nation of Israel. So the number 70 refers to the nations of the world. So here is Hizkuni's teaching about this. It says, Shema Yisrael. We have an Agadic text according to which the letter ayin in the word Shema is supposed to be hanging, i.e., not written directly on the line with the other letters in that word. It's enlarged and it's also a little bit displaced. The reason for this is supposed to be that God created the universe by using this letter. What is meant by this? Asks Hizkuni. Israel is one amongst the 70. So Israel is not outside the 70. Israel is one of the 70 nations. The number of nations are 1/70th of the number of the four-legged, red-blooded beasts that populate the earth. The number of four-legged, red-blooded beasts on earth are 1/70th the number of species of birds. The species of birds amount to 1/70th of the species of fish, which in turn are 1/70th of the number of different malignant forces or evil spirits. But the evil spirits are in turn 1/70th of the number of angels in heaven. And the Lord God presides over all these creatures as the sole rulers, right? So there's a little bit of an allusion in this number 70 to the entire creation and sort of the hierarchies of the creation, as it were. And that's a little bit embedded when we recite the Shema. Let's do it together. Let's close and cover our eyes. Let's prepare. Let's try to hear the primordial Shema, and then we'll say it together. Shema Yisroel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam V'Od. All right, let's do a little learning together. Well, we already did some learning. Let's do some learning in the Talmud. Okay, let me put this over here, over there. Very good. Okay. So where are we holding, as I mentioned? So today we're studying Daf Pei Beis, so page 82 of Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 7, and we're going to be completing our discussion of the 7th Mishnah in chapter 7 and opening our discussion of the 8th Mishnah. We read the Mishnah yesterday, but didn't have a chance to discuss it, so let's read it again. It's a short Mishnah. The 7th Mishnah. If the whole paschal lamb, or most of it, becomes tameh, ritually impure, again, this is when we're bringing the paschal offering, which we only do when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. We haven't been able to do this in 2,000 years, but we study the laws just as intently as if the temple were standing. So if the whole paschal lamb, or most of it, became ritually impure, one burns it before the temple, habira, with wood from the arrangement of wood on the altar that was given to the owners of the paschal lamb for this purpose. Right. So this is the idea. You're gonna burn it. Why you wouldn't burn an animal? You only burn meat. Right, so the lamb was slaughtered. If it was slaughtered, it was fit to be slaughtered. But then after it was slaughtered, something went wrong, and the meat of the paschal lamb became tameh. It came into contact with something that disqualified it. Either a corpse, or a person who had touched a corpse, or a person who had touched a creeping thing, somebody who had a discharge, etc. The meat became disqualified. Now we can't eat it. We must burn it. There's nothing else that can be done with it because this is kodshim. This is consecrated meat. It's not just any meat. It's meat that was consecrated as the paschal lamb. Now that it can't be eaten, it needs to be burned. And we're talking about the procedure for burning this meat and acknowledging its holiness. It has to be treated in a special way. right? So the Mishnah is going to make a distinction between if all of the lamb became tameh and all of it must be disposed of, or just a piece of it became tameh, and so that little piece can be disposed of, right? So if the whole lamb or most of it became tameh, one burns it at the temple, right? Before the temple with wood that is the property, right? It's firewood, which is the property of the temple and which can be used for this purpose, burning disqualified offerings. If a minority of it, just a small piece of the Paschal lamb, became tameh, ritually impure, and similarly with regard to the parts of the Paschal lamb that are left over, because the Torah says we eat it that night, the first night of Passover when the temple's standing, and then whatever is left over, it has to be burned. You can't have leftovers to just stick in the fridge, again, because this is consecrated, very special meat. It's going to be treated in a very special way. We eat it to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Once there's no more eating, it must be disposed of by burning. So if a minority of the lamb became impure, or with respect to the leftovers, which people are not going to eat beyond that night, so then the owners of the Paschal lamb burn it in their courtyards or on their roofs with their own wood. Only the miserly who want to save the expenditure of the wood burn it before the temple in order to benefit from the wood of the arrangement, right? So it sounds like the Mishnah is critical of these people who have the option to just burn it at home, but just so they don't have to spend money on the wood, they're going to walk back to the temple and use the wood of the temple in order to burn whatever they've got left over from the Paschal lamb or the part that became tameh. It may also be, as we'll see, that they just didn't, they just don't have wood available to them and it needs to be disposed of. So, okay, they know they can go back to the temple and get some wood to make a bonfire there. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that the Paschal lamb must be burned before the temple and that those who prefer to burn it elsewhere are not permitted to do so? So this is in the case of the whole lamb or the majority of the lamb became tameh. Rabbi Yosei Bar Hanina said, in order to embarrass them. Presumably the reason that most of the offering became impure is because the owners were not sufficiently careful with it. Therefore, the sages decreed that it be burned in a public place. Rav Steinsaltz makes a note here. In general, it is improper to embarrass anyone, even sinners. You don't embarrass a person because they've transgressed a law of the Torah. Nevertheless, in this case, the embarrassment motivates them to be diligent in the future and to ensure that their Paschal lambs do not become impure. So we actually learn from this idea that they made these people whose entire Paschal lamb became impure, that they must burn it at the temple courtyard. And maybe that is embarrassing to them. That is a very particular situation. It's specified here in the Talmud. And so we learn from that in general, we don't do that, right? So if you see somebody transgressing, you might give them a private and loving rebuke about how they might do better, but you never embarrass people publicly. In fact, the Talmud says elsewhere, it's better to jump into a fiery furnace, i.e. commit suicide, than to humiliate another person publicly. It was stated in the Mishna that if a minority of the Paschal lamb became ritually impure, and similarly if part of it was left over, it is burned in the owner's courtyards with their own wood. The Gemara is going to raise a contradiction to this based on what was taught in a different Mishnah. And similarly, in this Mishnah it says, and similarly, with regard to one who left Jerusalem and remembers that there is consecrated meat in his hand, which is now disqualified because it has left Jerusalem and must therefore be burned, right? So there's the Paschal lamb, which is consecrated and eaten, and there's also the peace offering. We've seen the festival peace offerings and other kinds of peace offerings where part of the offering is eaten, right? So it's consecrated meat that is fit to be eaten. So a person might have some on them, and then they forget about it. And then if they've left Jerusalem, and basically the spot that is being discussed here is where you're in view of the Temple Mount. So as long as you can still see it, you should return to it. But once you're so far away that it's no longer in view, okay, so then you can build a fire somewhere else. It still has to be disposed of, but you don't have to walk all the way back to the temple. That's in this other Mishnah. I think we had it in Tractate Eruvin, actually. And similarly, with one who left Jerusalem and remembers that there is consecrated meat in his hand, which is now disqualified because it has left Jerusalem, right? Consecrated meat, that's part of an offering. You have to eat it in Jerusalem. You can't leave Jerusalem with it. And it must therefore be burned. So if he passed Mount Scopus, that's that spot, he burns the meat at the site where he is located, and he need not return to burn it in Jerusalem. And if he has not yet passed Mount Scopus, he must return and burn it before the temple with wood from the altar fire, the arrangement. Wood from the arrangement. So the Mishnah's formulation uses the word remembered, right? If he remembers that he has consecrated meat on his person. So now the Gemara comments, where am I? The Mishnah's formulation uses the word remembered, implying that not only a large piece of meat that became ritually impure or somehow disqualified must be taken back and burned at the temple, but even a piece that is so small that it could be forgotten must be burned with wood from the arrangement. So this would seem to contradict the Mishnah that we're studying now, which says that if it's large, you take it back there, but if it's small, you can just burn it at your own fire at your house. Rav Chama bar Ukva said, this is not difficult, la kasha. Here, where it is stated that one burns it in the temple with wood from the arrangement, it is referring to a visitor who does not live in Jerusalem or have wood there, and he may therefore use wood from the arrangement, right? He doesn't know where to find wood to burn it. So, okay, so even though it's a small piece, he can go to the temple and use the wood of the arrangement there. While there, where it is stated that one burns it at home with one's own wood, it is referring to a resident of Jerusalem. He's got a fire that he can use. Rav Papa said, actually, this case and that case both refer to a visitor. Here, where it is stated that one may use wood from the arrangement, it is referring to one who has already set out on the road, and it is difficult for him to collect wood. There, where it is stated that one must use his own wood, it is referring to a case in which the visitor has not yet set out on the road, and he can gather his own wood. So it would seem like we're taking into account the idea that people made pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the festivals, for Passover, for Shavuos, for Sukkot. So if they're bringing, for example, a Chagiga, the festival peace offering, and then some of it became disqualified, has to be disposed of, where's he going to do that? Now, if he's made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and he's well-to-do, okay, so, he's staying at an inn, he's rented a house, he's got an Airbnb, he's got a courtyard, he's got a roof, he's got a place where he's got a bonfire that he can use to dispose of this extra meat. But maybe he already checked out of his Airbnb and he's back on the road. So then the question comes up, does he need to go to the temple? Does he have to go somewhere else? He doesn't have his own fire that he can use. These are the practical matters that we're discussing here. Okay. Rav Zevid disagreed with Rav Papa, and he clarified Rav Chama bar Ukva's opinion. He said, actually, it can be explained as Rav Chama initially said. Here, it is referring to a visitor. There, it is referring to a resident. And even though he did not yet set out on the road, a visitor may use wood from the arrangement, in other words, the temple's firewood, in order to burn this disqualified meat, for the following reason. Since he does not have his own wood, the sages treated him like the misers. As we read in this Mishnah, the one that we're studying now, Mishnah 7 in chapter 7, the misers burn it before the temple in order to benefit from the wood of the arrangement. This indicates that anyone who is unconcerned about his reputation, like a miser, may use wood from the arrangement, and this is not considered to be a misuse of consecrated property. Similarly, the sages also permitted a visitor to use wood from the arrangement. So a visitor, somebody on the road, is like a miser in that he may not have wood available to him. The miser might have wood available to him, but he's too cheap to use it, and he doesn't care that his reputation is going to take a hit when he goes to the temple and uses the temple's wood for disposing of this consecrated meat. Now, it's important to understand, and we're going to discuss it more in the passages that follow, that when we're talking about using firewood that belongs to the temple, yes, we can use it to make a fire to dispose of disqualified consecrated meat that had entered the jurisdiction of the temple, as it were, because it was consecrated. It became disqualified. It can't be eaten, so it needs to be burned. But we're still engaged in a mitzvah, right? We're making a proper disposal of something which had been set aside for a holy purpose. What you can't do is take some firewood from the temple just to, barbecue your steak for lunch, right? Which is just when it's unconsecrated meat, or because you're cold and you want to make a little fire to warm up your hands. That would be inappropriate because that would be personal benefit from temple property, and that is absolutely a Torah transgression. You can't do that. The sages taught in the Tosefta, right? So the Tosefta was the very first commentary on the Mishnah, almost contemporaneous with it. If individuals came and wanted to burn the Paschal lamb that had become tameh, ritually impure, in their courtyards, and they wanted to take wood from the arrangement, right? Wood from the temple, to use for this purpose, one does not listen to them. If you want to use the temple's firewood, you make your fire in the temple precinct. If you want to make a fire at your own house or in your own courtyard or on your own roof, then you go find wood for that somewhere else. We don't allow a person, even for a fire which is going to dispose of consecrated meat, to take temple firewood home to their house. Can you guess why? Giving a moment to pause. Can you guess why? Right? This is the kind of fear that the sages will show all the time. The problem is, if the person takes wood from the temple that can only be used for holy purposes, like making a fire to dispose of consecrated but disqualified meat, if they take that wood home and now it's just some firewood sitting around at their house, maybe some of it will get used for the fire to dispose of consecrated meat, and maybe they won't use all of the wood, and some of the wood will just be sitting around, and then later they'll just use it to fire up their oven or to make a little fire to warm their hands, and then they would have personally benefited from temple property, and that is a transgression. So the sages say you can't take firewood, the temple's firewood, home to your house. That's to protect you from coming to make that transgression. So if somebody wanted to take wood from the arrangement home to back to their house, to their courtyard for this purpose, one does not listen to them. Similarly, if they wanted to burn it before the temple with their own wood, one does not listen to them. Now that one's interesting. Why? Right? So if you're going to make the fire at the temple and bring your own wood to do it, it would seem like, oh well, you're just, you're not benefiting from the temple's firewood, even for the purpose of burning consecrated but disqualified meat. You're going to bring your own firewood. It's almost like you're making a donation to the temple to do that, but you're not making a donation to the temple. You're just using your own firewood. And now we'll hear why the sages say no to that. The Gemara asks, granted, if people want to burn it with wood from the arrangement in their own courtyards, one does not listen to them, and this is because the sages were concerned lest they leave over some of the wood they took to burn the Paschal lamb and come to experience a mishap with it by using the wood for another purpose. But in the case in which they wanted to burn the offering before the temple with their own wood, what is the reason one does not listen to them? Rav Yosef said, it is in order not to embarrass one who does not have the means to bring his own wood. If it were permitted to bring one's own wood to burn in the temple, people would realize that only the poor people take wood from the temple, and this would be embarrassing to the poor. Rava said, Actually, it is due to suspicion, a different reason. People would take back their own unused wood that they had brought, if they brought more wood than they needed, so then they would take it home, but it might look like they're taking temple firewood back to their house, like they're misappropriating temple property. And so that just to avoid that suspicion, even that people would cast a look at, would look at them with suspicion because are they taking wood from the temple? Just to eliminate that problem, we say that if you're going to burn some of this consecrated but disqualified meat at the temple, you use the temple's firewood for that purpose. You don't bring your own firewood. Right, but there were two reasons given. One is that there would be a distinction between rich and poor, who can afford to bring their own wood and who's going to use the temple's wood if everyone's making their fires at the temple. And the other reason is to avoid suspicion that people might be misappropriating temple firewood when they take their own wood that they brought there and some of it was unused and then they take it home. The Gemara asks, "My benehu," right? So that my benehu. Very typical question that we see in the Talmud. My benehu means what is between them. Two reasons were given. One is right, so we don't embarrass the poor. The other one is so that people don't look at these people with suspicion. What is the practical difference between these two reasons for why we don't allow people to bring their own firewood to use at the temple when making a fire to dispose of this consecrated but disqualified meat? My benehu. What is the practical difference between these two answers? The Gemara says, the practical difference between them is the case of one who brings reeds or palm branches that are not fit for the arrangement. Since these types of branches are not used for the arrangement of wood on the altar inside the temple, there is no concern that people would be wrongly suspected of stealing them from the temple. Therefore, Rava would permit it. However, the concern that the poor will be embarrassed is still relevant, and so Rav Yosef would prohibit them from bringing this other kind of fuel to make their fire with. Another Mishnah teaches a similar dispute between Rav Yosef and Rava on a different subject. We learned in a Mishnah there in Tractate Tamid. The head of the watch, okay, so now we're talking about the priestly watches, meaning that the priests who serve in the temple were divided into watches, and they would only serve 1 week at a time. So there was whatever number of priests are necessary to do the avodah, the work of worship in the temple. Bringing people's offerings, all the service that they do, the divine service. They would do that. This group of priests would do it for a week, and then they would go back to their houses, and they would be replaced by the next watch. Right. So they would serve for 1 week. And I believe there was something like 20 some, there was 25, 26, something like that, priestly watches, maybe 24 was the number. And they would basically serve twice a year, and then there were special groups that would serve during the big holiday periods. But basically the priests who were working in the temple would actually only do so for a week at a time, twice a year, and there were enough watches. So there was the head of the watch. It's not the Kohen Gadol. It's not the high priest of the nation. Rather, it's sort of like the chief of the priests, the administrative chief of the priests, who is the head of the watch, the priests that are serving the temple that week. So the head of the watch would stand the ritually impure, the tamei priests, at the entrance of the eastern gate each morning. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that they did not simply send them home without making them stand at the entrance to the eastern gate? Right, so a tamei priest, a priest that somehow became ritually impure because he had some kind of liquid emission from his body, or because he came into contact with a corpse or with a dead creeping thing, etc. So now he can't serve. Right, a priest who is in a state of tuma, ritual impurity, it cannot serve in the temple until he's gone through a purification process, and then he's ready to serve again. So why make the tamei priests line up at the eastern gate in the morning? Why not just send them home, since they can't serve in the temple anyway? Rav Yosef said it was in order to embarrass them for not having been careful to avoid becoming tamei, to avoid becoming ritually impure. Rava said no, they would stand them there to avoid suspicion, so that people would realize that the reason they were not serving during their watch at the temple is because they had somehow become tameh, rather than in order to leave and go work at their regular professions, right? So the priests, it's like they were in the Army Reserve, and they're called up twice a year, and now they have to serve the nation. Sometimes that's inconvenient, right? Maybe they had a big business deal was going on, and suddenly they have to drop everything and go do their service in the temple. Maybe some of them would think, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to do my deal. There's enough priests there even without me. And then, or maybe because one of the priests who you expect to be serving the temple that week isn't, and people might suspect that he went through a process like that and he'd rather do his business deal than be of service in the temple. So to avoid that suspicion, if the reason they're not serving that day or that week is because they've become tameh, they're lined up in the morning. So like, okay, these are the priests who became tameh. If you think that that's embarrassing to them because they should have avoided it, so then you're in the camp with, who's that? That was Rava? That was Rav Yosef, right? That they would be, that they were sort of publicly held out there to embarrass them. But Rav is saying, no, actually, it's for their benefit. Like, it happens. People become tameh, often through no fault of their own. There's no need to be embarrassed about it. Better, people should understand that the reason this priest is not serving the temple that day is because he became tameh than because he just ran off to go finish a business deal. The Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between these two opinions? Ma b'nehu. The Gemara answers, the practical difference between them is the case of pampered people who never work, whom others would not suspect of avoiding temple service in order to work in their regular professions, because they never work anyway, so no one's going to suspect that they ran off to go to work. Alternatively, it is the case of one who twists ropes for a living. No one would suspect someone of missing the temple service in order to work in such a lowly and non-profitable occupation. These two categories of people would not have to stand at the gate, according to Rava's opinion, because of suspicion, but they would have to, according to Rav Yosef's opinion, if they became tameh. Rav Yosef said we stand them there in the morning to embarrass them for having become tameh, because they're priests and they're supposed to be incredibly careful not to allow themselves to become ritually impure. It's not like, they're going to be like, have their hands and, neck and hands in a pillory and be like, shamed and humiliated before the nation. They just have to stand there in the morning like, okay, these are the priests that became tameh. They will not be able to serve today. If you are a pilgrim, come to Jerusalem and you have a favorite priest that you like to bring your offerings for you, and you might be disappointed that, your priest wasn't available. Why wasn't he available? Well, if you were there in the morning and he was tameh, then you would have seen that he was in a state of ritual impurity, and that's why he wasn't available to bring your offering. All right, that ends our discussion of Mishnah number 7. We're going to just do a quick reading and opening the discussion of Mishnah number 8. So I'm coming to your questions and comments. If you've got them, put them in the comments now. Mishnah number 8. A paschal lamb that was taken out of its permissible area, or that became ritually impure, should be burned immediately on the eve of Passover. Now, we've been talking about this quite a bit, right? So the paschal lamb or the paschal goat, young goat, 1 year, less than 1 year old, was slaughtered. Somehow it came into contact with a source of tumah. It became tameh. It can't be eaten. It needs to be disposed of. It's going to be burned. Now we're adding something else here. This Mishnah is adding something else. Even if it remained in a state of ritual purity, it's still tahor. It can still become disqualified. We've already seen it could become disqualified if its owner became tameh. Its owner came into contact with impurity, and now the owner won't be able to eat it, and so we'd have to dispose of the offering. But now it's neither that the offering became tameh nor that its owner became tameh. Now we're adding a whole new thing, that the meat itself somehow was removed from its area of permissibility. And it would seem from what we've seen a little bit of a hint to this. For example, if you remove it from Jerusalem, right, consecrated meat has to be eaten in Jerusalem, whether it's the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, or some other festival peace offering. that parts of it which are eaten, they can't be taken out of Jerusalem. They can only be eaten in Jerusalem. Certain offerings cannot even be taken out of the temple. So we'll see what's going on here. So a paschal lamb that was taken out of its permissible area or that became ritually impure, it should be burned immediately on the eve of Passover, right? Before Passover began. So we slaughter the paschal lamb on Erev Pesach, the afternoon before Passover begins that night. So if it becomes tameh during that afternoon, you should burn it immediately. Once Passover starts, this disqualified meat that needs to be burned, we don't burn it on the first day of Passover. We're allowed to cook, so we can make a fire for cooking, but we don't make a fire for disposing of disqualified meat. For that, if the holiday had already begun, we're going to set it aside and we're going to wait until the second day of Passover, which inside Israel is not the full-fledged festival, right? The full-fledged festival is the first day and the last day. Outside of Israel, those are both 2-day holidays. So we would wait until, outside of Israel, there is no, there's no consecrated meat. So this would only be, so we would wait until the second day of Passover, the second night, and then it would be okay to burn this disqualified meat. Okay, so it should be burned immediately on the eve of Passover, right? If we still have time before Passover begins. If the owners became ritually impure or died, its form must be allowed to decay by leaving it for a period of time instead of burning it immediately. So that's interesting. If the meat became tameh, we burn it immediately as long as Passover hasn't begun. If the owners became tameh, right? So if the owners became ritually impure, there's no inherent problem with the meat itself. It's just that there's no one to eat it because the only people who can eat the paschal lamb are the ones who've registered to eat it. Those people became tameh. They can no longer eat it. So the meat is going to have to be disposed of. It's going to have to be burned. But since there's no actual problem with the meat, what the Mishna is saying is we actually just set it aside and we kind of basically let it spoil a little bit. We let it decay a little bit. We let it become a little bit bad, and then we burn it, right? If its owners became ritually impure or died, its form must be allowed to decay by leaving it for a period of time instead of burning it immediately. And it should be burned on the 16th of Nisan, right, the second day of Passover, immediately after the first day of the festival ends. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, this too should be burned immediately because it has no one to eat it, which is also so severe a disqualification that decay of form is not required, right? So we have a dispute here between the rabbis and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, right? If the owners became tameh, the rabbis say, okay, the meat itself is still qualified, but there's no one to eat it, so we allow it to decay a little bit and then we burn it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, if there's no one to eat it, it's a full disqualification. It should be burned immediately, even on Erev Pesach. We open our discussion of the Gemara on this. The Gemara asks, granted, the fact that ritually impure sacrificial meat must be burned is written in the Torah, as it says, the flesh that touches any impure item shall not be eaten, it shall be burned in fire, right? So right there, it's in the written Torah. This is why meat that was consecrated and then became disqualified because it became tameh, we burn it. It shall be burned in a fire, it shall not be eaten. But sacrificial meat that is taken out of its permissible area, from where do we derive that it must be burned? How do we know that it must be burned? Okay, meat that became disqualified because it was tameh, we burn it. Got it. It says so in the Torah. But meat that was taken out of its permissible area, how do we know that we burn it? Maybe we just bring it back into its permissible area and then we could eat it. Apparently not. Once it's out of the permissible area, it becomes disqualified and then it needs to be burned. But how do we know that? This is a very interesting derivation that Gemara is going to bring in this incident in the Torah where Moses sought to scold his brother Aaron, who, as the high priest, and with his sons, the priests, were supposed to eat some consecrated meat as part of an offering process, but they didn't do it. Turns out that the reason Aaron knew, and he was right, that he couldn't eat it is because he was in mourning, and so were his sons. Who were they mourning? The two sons of Aaron who died in the incident of the strange fire, Nadav and Avihu. Right? So their father and their brothers, on the day that they died, were in a state of acute mourning, and priests in a state of acute mourning do not eat consecrated meat. But because of the questioning the questions that Moses puts to Aaron about this incident before he understands exactly what happened, we learn some laws, including this idea that if it goes outside of its area, it becomes disqualified, as the Gemara explains. This idea that meat that goes outside of permissible area is disqualified and must be burned, it is derived from the verses describing Moses admonishing Aaron and his sons about the fact that they did not eat the sin offering on the 8th day of inauguration. In other words, the 8th day of the inauguration of, I'm not sure if it was the inauguration of the priests or the inauguration of the tabernacle. I think it was of the tabernacle. As it is written, behold, maybe that was the same day, I'm not sure. Behold, this is Leviticus 10:18. Behold, its blood was not brought into the sanctuary within. You should have eaten it in the sanctuary as I commanded. Right? Moses told Aaron that you're supposed to eat this meat of the sin offering. That's something that only the priests do. And you didn't do it. Why didn't you do it? So one thing that Moses says is its blood was not brought into the sanctuary within. So you should have eaten it in the sanctuary. This should be understood as follows. Moses said to Aaron, why didn't you eat the sin offering? Is it because its blood entered the innermost chamber, the sanctuary, in which case it must be burned? Right? So it would have been disqualified if its blood, the blood that was part of this offering, for some reason entered the Holy of Holies, where no one goes. Only the high priest goes in there on Yom Kippur. For some reason it went in there, maybe that disqualified the offering. Aaron said to him, no, that's not what happened. Moses said to him, perhaps it was taken outside of its boundary, and that is the reason that you did not eat it. Aaron said to him, no, it was kept in the sacred area, i.e. in the courtyard. Moses said to him, if it was in the sacred area the entire time, behold, its blood was not brought into the sanctuary within, so why didn't you eat it? Its blood wasn't taken to a place where the blood shouldn't have been taken. The meat itself was kept in its area of permissibility, it seems like nothing went wrong. Why didn't you eat it? And this proves by inference that if it leaves its boundary, or alternatively, if its blood enters within the sanctuary of the temple, it must be burned, and this can serve as a model for all offerings. I'm just going to skip to the end of our daf, where we get Aaron's explanation. Okay, so it was taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Nehemiah says Aaron's sin offering that was burned on the 8th day of inauguration was burned due to acute mourning, as that was the day that his sons Nadav and Avihu died. For this reason, it is stated that Aaron explained to Moses, this is Leviticus 10:19, now that events such as these befell me, were I to eat this day's sin offering, would the Lord approve? In other words, it was due to the deaths of his sons, which Aaron referred to as events such as these, that Aaron burned the sin offering instead of eating it. Right? He just felt that because he was in a state of acute mourning for his two sons who died that day, he was just not going to have the right intentionality when he was performing this part of the divine service of eating some of the meat of the sin offering. Okay, let us go to your comments and questions. Hold on. Aha. Michael Stein adds the comment that Israel is a desert, wood is a premium. Maybe we take firewood for granted when we're thinking that, these people are miserly and they don't want to use wood. They want to use the wood of the temple. But, wood is not so common in a desert like Israel is. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Nina's telling me there's no other questions. So tomorrow is Friday. Our regular time is noon, as always on Fridays, as we get ready for Shabbos. So a Hodesh Tov to you. We wish each other Hodesh Tov. That you should have a good month. We're entering the new month of Adar, which is the month of joy, the month that contains Purim. We're very excited. We're also getting ready for Shabbos. So all these are good reasons to, go off from this class where you've spent some good quality time learning with your head high.